Gives me an honour to call you to the stage.
Prime Ministers, Speaker, Leader of the Opposition, Ray and the Cohen boys, as Prime Minister Hawke described you. All of us work for Barry Cohen, even when we're not employed by him. When I was elected to Parliament, it made no difference. He still thought I worked for him and just needed to implement his million bright ideas. Barry was, in the full Australian vernacular meaning of the word, a character. He was the first sports commentator for Sydney's TCN 9. He was the first boss to join the Shop Assistants Union. Even the legendary Jono Johnson was taken aback by Barry's interest in Labor when Barry was running his beloved fashion store in St Ives, Fashion Plate. Many years later, as Prime Minister Hawke recounted, he turned the Central Coast seat of Robertson into an absolute Labor bastion, holding it from 1969 to 1990. He was the last opposition male to hold the position of spokesperson on women's affairs, as in 1978 there were no women in the House of Representatives at all. Barry was elected 9 times between 1969 and 1990. There'll be few who can replicate that. I see Philip Ruddock in the audience, perhaps he can. But as Martin Luther King said, political longevity has its place. Barry's passions for the arts, heritage and environment were fulfilled, as Prime Minister Hawke said when he became Minister for those portfolios. His passion for Kakadu in particular, I believe, established it in the public imagination alongside other Indigenous icons such as Uluru and the Kimberleys. He was a visionary in road safety from the 1970s, demanding vehicles have airbags, something we all take for granted now but was very forward-thinking in those days. He was the Environment Minister who forbade the mining of mineral sands on Fraser Island. He was one of the Hawke government's spearheads in preserving the natural wonders of the Franklin in Tasmania. But successful life in business and in politics was not enough for him. He was the author of 9 books between 1987 and 2011 and an immense collection of newspaper and magazine columns, which I've spent the last week reading. Again, I might say, I read them mostly the first time. Some of his columns were excoriating about topics as varied as the wit and wisdom of the New South Wales right, the perils of nouvelle cuisine, the superannuation industry, where he argued that government should, quote, save seniors from racetrack touts posing as fund managers. Cohen made unpopular forays in his immense newspaper output, arguing that ministerial travel ought to be judged on its outcome, not on its cost, that backbenchers should resume their independence and resume their rights at question time. He was a devoted ally and admirer of Senator John Faulkner and his plans to clean up Labor. Barry's whiplash pen critiqued people on his own sides, from Peter Garrett to Graham Richardson, and most memorably, former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. In the early 1990s, years before Rudd became a national figure, Cohen gave him a character evaluation that, reading it 20 years later, through all that happened in the intervening years, makes Barry sound like the Oracle of Bungendore. But big brave Barry didn't simply snipe from the safety of his newspaper columns. He was a fierce critic of the maladministration of the Interparliamentary Union and attended his last gathering of that august organisation, where he was subject to a 2-hour harangue from Fidel Castro. With incredible courage, next day he gave it back, both barrels, to the Cuban dictator, and he left Havana alive. Barry's gentlest side was shown in his passion for the Indigenous people of this country. This began with his super involvement prior to politics as the non-Indigenous assistant to the Aboriginal campaign for the successful 1967 referendum. And you can see that years later when you read his tribute to his mentor and Indigenous friend Faith Bandler on her death, probably one of the most memorable newspaper columns I've ever read. If all of that wasn't enough for Barry, he was the Deputy Chair of this old Parliament House and successfully participated in its transition to the Museum of Democracy that it is now. Cohen, throughout his parliamentary career and newspaper life, shared with me an immense pride in his Jewish origins and was a subtle and informed advocate of Israel. The weight of the Nazi genocide of millions, including large segments of his family, weighed very heavily on the shoulders of his memory. Ray and he did great justice to his murdered relatives, visiting Poland and writing a searing account of the fate of the Kozivoda family in an article that you can get from the National Archives, but was published in the Bulletin. It's probably easy to get it from my office. I do urge you to read it. Lastly, let me deal with the difficult topic of Barry's last years. His courage in dealing with his dementia, mentioned by all of our leaders, was matched only by Adam and Ray's devotion to his increasing physical fragility. He even turned his suffering into a good story. When I got word, Barry said, when word got out that I had joined the list of dementia sufferers, one of the first calls I got was from an old friend. Mr. Howard's calling, was the message from the nurse. I don't know a Mr. Howard, unless it's a former Prime Minister. That's the one, replied the nurse. Now, I'm proud that a few months before his death, his Praetorian Guard, his old ministerial staff, led by Dr. Sergio Sergi, Peter Conway, myself and Adam, made our last visit to bid him farewell, the nursing home in Goulburn. It was very difficult. I'm so glad we did it. He recognised all of us. He was obviously fading. It was very emotional. He cried. It was wonderful that we had a chance to say goodbye. Barry Cohen, big Australian, big character. His memory is a blessing.